Have you ever wondered why giving yourself over to God is so much more difficult than just striving harder? Perhaps you have prayed consistently, asked God to direct your life, and genuinely desired His will. However, you still find yourself clinging to certain plans, anxieties, or expectations deep below. You convince yourself that you have faith in Him, but anxiety soon reappears when things are unclear.
Letting go is too dangerous, so attempt to maintain control. But what if we are unable to accept the biggest rewards that God desires? What if giving your life to the only person capable of carrying it is surrender rather than losing control? In the coming minutes, we will discuss 7 things that start to alter when a Christian genuinely gives God control over every aspect of their life. And after
You might never view surrender the same way again if you recognize these shifts. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 serve as the basis for what we talk about. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding, it states. Give yourself over to Him in every way, and He will straighten your path. Take note of something significant. A straight route is not the first thing that God promises. First, He demands total submission and confidence. Many of us desire God's guidance with letting go of our own authority. However, God constantly demonstrates in Scripture that transformation starts when we stop insisting on our own path and start following His. This pattern keeps coming up because surrender is not the end of faith. Rather, it is the beginning of true confidence. When you completely give yourself over to God, the first thing that happens is that the pressure to control starts to give way to calm.
Everything. I have heard about a believer who tried to foresee every scenario every day. Because they were afraid of making the wrong judgment, every decision became exhausting. They prayed all the time, but because they felt that everything hinged on them, their hearts continued to race. However, many believers are unaware that anxiety frequently develops in areas where surrender has not yet taken hold. When we secretly think that our future depends solely on our
own wisdom, maintaining peace becomes unfeasible. Consider Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He prayed honestly in the face of unspeakable anguish before uttering the words, "Not my will, but yours be done." His heart rested entirely in the will of the Father, even though the situation did not instantly improve. The conflict between his will and God's was eliminated by surrender, not the crucifixion itself. Trust and control. Your priorities start to move from short-term success to long-term purpose, which is the second transition. Consider a person whose entire identity is based on their accomplishments, notoriety, or financial stability. Almost all of their prayers center on opportunities, advancements, or individual objectives. None of those aspirations are inevitably incorrect. Yet, eventually, people start to notice something different. God gradually modifies their desires. Success is no longer as fulfilling as it once was. Serving others, developing one's religion, and appeasing God take precedence above winning people over. Pay close attention. This is not a sign of diminished ambition. Finding a higher purpose is what it is. In Matthew, Jesus taught,
6:33, to put God's righteousness and kingdom first. When God takes precedence, everything else starts to find its rightful place. When God urged Abraham to leave everything familiar behind, he underwent this metamorphosis. Receiving promises was not the beginning of his greatest blessing. It started with giving up his own goals, not his own aspirations or everlasting purpose.
The third thing that happens when you completely give yourself over to God is that obedience takes precedence over comfort. Any believer may find this to be one of the most difficult lessons because our innate tendency is to select the option that seems easiest or safest. I recall hearing of a woman who felt God guiding her to forgive someone who had caused her great pain.
every time she prayed for serenity, the same conviction reappeared.
She came to see that the obedience God was requesting was necessary for the tranquility she desired. However, this is what makes everything different. Many Christians ask God to ease their anguish as He uses it to mold their hearts. Consider Jonah. The storm at sea was never his biggest challenge. It was his unwillingness to submit to God's guidance. God's plan for Jonah's life didn't start to progress until he stopped running. Frequent obedience
feels expensive at first, but surrender shows that God's guidance is always superior to our own comprehension. Please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment if this message resonates with you. Lord, I surrender every part of my life. The next 4 changes, which may be even more profound than the ones we have just discussed, show what God starts to transform deep within a surrendered heart. Stay tuned.
Your identity becomes established in what God says about you, rather than what the outside world says about you, when you completely surrender to God. Many Christians covertly pursue approval for years. They gauge their value by how accomplished they seem, what other people think of them, or whether their goals seem to be succeeding. I used to know a man who
He was always comparing his life to that of those around him. Every time someone else was blessed, he wondered if God had forgotten about him. His confidence fluctuated according to his situation. However, many believers are unaware of this. Where the heart has not yet surrendered, comparison endures. You no longer need everyone's approval when you completely give your life to God, since your identity is no longer based on what other people think of you.
Concerning David prior to his coronation, God had already selected him long before anyone honored him. David's worth came from God's purpose for his life, not from public fame, even while he was tending sheep in obscurity. Comparison starts to lose its power when you realize that you are a part of God, not human approval, but God's acceptance. The fifth one thing that shifts is that instead of being frustrating, waiting turns into a season of preparation. Because we inherently equate delays with disappointment, waiting is one of the most difficult experiences for any believer. Imagine someone who consistently prays for a response that never seems to materialize. Weeks turn into months, and months become into years. They initially question whether God's silence is a sign that He has forgotten about them. However, during that same season, they start to become more patient, wise, humble, and reliant on Him. Pay close attention. While you wait, God frequently works most effectively within of you rather than outside of you. Almost no one in the Bible grasped this pattern as well as Joseph did. He was imprisoned, enslaved, and betrayed prior to his reign in Egypt. Those agonizing years came useless. However, each challenging season equipped him for the responsibility that awaited him. Before altering the situation, God was molding the guy. When you truly surrender, you can have assurance that God is working faithfully, without delay or preparation, even when nothing seems to be occurring. When you completely give yourself over to God, the sixth thing that happens is that your prayers become less about altering your situation and more about understanding the heart of God. I recall hearing of a believer who consistently prayed with specific ideas for God's response to each circumstance. Each request featured precise time, well-thought-out solutions, and particular results. But then a lovely thing occurred. Their prayers grew easier. They started pleading with God to reveal His plan rather than to pursue theirs. This alters everything. Prayer becomes an expression of confidence rather than instructions when it is surrendered. Paul the Apostle comes to mind. He begged God to take away what he referred to as his thorn in the flesh. However, Paul was not prepared for God's response. God provided adequate grace and power via weakness
rather than instant elimination. Paul eventually realized that understanding God's might was more important than getting the initial response he
desired. Being the person God is calling us to be, not my plan, His presence, is sometimes the best response to prayer, even if we don't get all we ask for. Your life becomes available for reasons far greater than yourself, which is the seventh and possibly most beautiful thing that happens when you truly surrender to God. This is the pinnacle of surrender. Expression. Initially, we frequently ask God what He can do for us. A surrendered heart, however, eventually starts to ask a different inquiry. How can you utilize me, Lord? Imagine Isaiah in front of God's holiness. Isaiah did not negotiate the upcoming task after realizing the majesty of God and being cleansed by Him. In response, he merely said, "Here am I, send me." The essence of total surrender is revealed in just a few words. A life completely surrendered
To God now centers on obedient obedience wherever He leads, rather than on personal comfort. This does not imply that the path will always be simple. Because it is directed by the one who sees the finish from the beginning, you can be confident that every step has an eternal purpose. As you consider these 7 adjustments, keep in mind that surrender is a process that takes time to complete. It is a daily choice to put your faith in God's wisdom over your own, His timing over your impatience, and His purpose over your inclinations. The more you entrust your life to Him, the more you realize that He has always been faithful. Choose the one thing you have been putting off and present it to the Lord in prayer today. If you were moved by this message, please leave a remark saying, "Lord, I trust your will." Give this video to someone who needs a reminder right now.